Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. I'm Stephen Meyer, and this is part 4 of my in my series entitled "The Underrated Fallacy." And in this particular episode, we're going to concentrate on bands that are accessible and underrated, or at least considered underrated. Now, my central thesis in this entire series is that most heavy bands really aren't underrated, that really is sort of a misnomer. In other words, in our excitement to champion bands we really like as a heavy metal fan or a hard rock fan, we'll often say, I can't believe how underrated this band is, or they really deserve a bigger audience than what they've got, right? But when we when we examine this a little closer, in most cases, these bands really aren't underrated. They probably have the audience that they probably should have, right? So in this, as I say, in this particular episode, we're really going to hit this question in some ways really head on, with bands that really are quite accessible, but still don't have big audiences. And a lot of people will say, well, that's a weird thing. But in most cases, I think it's still justifiable. So let us jump into this a little bit. All right. Accessible and underrated. Is this possible? Okay. Well, we might not endorse it or even necessarily like it. Many times when one of our favorite hard rock bands put out something that us heavy fanatics deem melodic, memorable, even hummable, right? We wonder why more people aren't getting it, right? Of course, we understand that most folks are not going to happily blast epic doom metal from Candlemass, although I would, but I get why most people wouldn't, or rage along with Entombed, right? But why isn't everyone listening to King's X, right? And you know what? There actually are several groups loosely classified as hard rock and or metal, which have a number of accessible songs that never appeal to a great number of middle-of-the-road music fans. But I got to tell you, King's X is perhaps the epitome of this seeming paradox, right? So much so that it has become almost cliche to associate underappreciation with King's X. In a weird, ironic way, perhaps their greatest claim to fame, King's X, and most discussed talking point centers on this mysterious dilemma of being so underrated. And I can't tell you how many times when I've read about King's X or talked to friends who are big fans, that always comes up. Inevitably, it's like, this band is so underrated. Why? Why are they so underrated, right? I got to tell you, though, to me at least, it's not that big a puzzle, right? And this is what I'm going to try to explain in this episode. And like I say, by extension, try to explain why just because you're accessible doesn't necessarily mean you should be big, right? Okay. So sure, King's X is heavy, but they're so catchy, fans will say, right? And yeah, they are. There's no question. They're all those things and more, which we'll talk about. There is no denying the immense talent of this power trio from Texas, who released their debut album, Out of the Silent Planet, in the late 1980s. We're going to see the time frame for this is really important for reasons I'll get into. But armed with a versatile guitarist with enviable tone, Ty Tabor, great player, a primary vocalist and bassist capable of singing driving heavy metal, subtle ballads, and seemingly everything in between. This guy is beyond gifted. Doug Pinnick, sometimes spelled D-U-G, a truly great drummer in Jerry Gaskell, peerless harmony background vocals from all concerned, a Svengali producer, Sam Taylor, at least earlier in their career, and perhaps most importantly, incredible songwriting abilities that are both musically challenging and lyrically charming. And one has what would appear to be a can't miss situation. I don't think I'm really exaggerating here. Anybody who is a King's X fan will probably agree with everything I just said. The band really is that special, right? But aside from some initial buzz circulating around their first 4 albums and a few minor successes. Didn't want to call them hits because that would really be exaggerating. We'll call them sort of successes. But there's a couple songs out there that they might sort of be known for, where they sort of edged up to the mainstream for a period of time, you might say. So, Goldilocks, a comparatively well-known song from their first album, Out of the Silent Planet. Over My Head and Summerland from Gretchen Goes to Nebraska, their second album. A song called It's Love from Faith, Hope, Love of 1990. And probably their best-known song, Black Flag, from the self-titled album of 92, right? But beyond that, beyond these reasonable successes, King's X has remained little more than a cult band, right? Before the release of deep fan favorite Dogman, which was put out in 94, the band parted ways with their producer manager, Sam Taylor, and from there continued to unleash amazing albums that were unceremoniously met with relative silence from the average music fan, right? I think if you were to put a bunch of King's X fans in a room and get them to rank their albums, probably Dogman is going to be near the top for a lot of people, but it just didn't resonate with the mainstream, and none of the material really has, at least not for any length of time. And then as we sort of go further in time, it doesn't really even get better for them. The downward spiral in interest appears to especially take hold after the album Ear Candy, which was put out in 96, an album aptly, if not somewhat sarcastically titled. In other words, wake up mainstream, you should like this. I mean, they called it Ear Candy. Well, they didn't, or not enough people thought it was Ear Candy, right? Admittedly, the band got a little more eccentric on such albums such as Tapehead, released in 1998, Please Come Home, Mr. Bulbous, a title Budgie would be proud of. See part 3 if you want to know more about Budgie, which was released in 2000, and Manic Moonlight of 2001. But for the most part, the meshing of heavy hard rock with incredibly accessible vocal harmonies remained a trademark and apparently only of appeal to their keen hardcore following, right? 3 more albums were released in the new millennium. Black Like Sunday in 2013, Ogre Tones in 05, and 15 in 2008. And there are plans for a new King's X opus in 2022. In fact, I think it's pretty for sure we're going to get an album. I know I'm stoked, right? Inevitably, the new material will be warmly welcomed by the faithful, as it always is, but probably not anybody else, right? I can't see that this album is suddenly going to break through to the mainstream. Hey, it'd be great if it did, but I think there's good reasons why this has never happened. And we're sort of going to get into that. But before we do, going to take a little bit of a detour here, and I want to put a couple things in context. And this will sort of help us understand, I think, why King's X, as accessible as they were, as melodic as they are, never sort of broke through to the big time. And to help us understand that, I think we have to understand a couple key trends that have gone on in music over the last few decades. Okay, so I prepared a couple fancy little charts here. Well, they're not that fancy, but anyway, this is sort of my sort of take on the tolerance for musical diversity that the mainstream has had, or just music bands in general have had sort of through the decades. And what do I mean by musical diversity? That bands were allowed to do more than just one thing. In fact, that they were rewarded for being musically diverse, right? So if you were a heavy band, if you did more than just be heavy and hard rock all the time, fans were great with that. In fact, they kind of expected it. Now, if you were a prog rock band, especially in the 70s, of course, you're always incorporating all kinds of different styles and moods in your music. I mean, progressive rock kind of implies that. But I would argue all very popular bands, including hard rock bands, were typically quite diverse. And I think if you go back to the 60s and especially in the 70s, you can kind of see the way my chart's sort of working here. This was the apex. This was the peak for tolerance of musical diversity, that bands did all kinds of things other than their main thing, which might be hard rock or prog rock or whatever, right? And I think that definitely peaked in the early 70s, right? And then since then, there's been a lack of tolerance, I would say, for musical diversity. And I think that we sort of trough out, if you like, in the late 80s and early 90s, right? It's at this time where bands are no longer rewarded for being very diverse. They're actually rewarded for being actually fairly tunnel vision, right? And this coincides with the rise of all the subgenres in heavy music. So it's in the late 80s, early 90s where you get thrash metal and doom metal and death metal and black metal and prog metal and math metal and grindcore. The new wave of British heavy metal was sort of a movement as well, and a genre, and on it goes, right? There's many others, but those symphonic metal, on it goes, right? And so bands that were successful, generally power metal, that were successful sort of in the early 90s were ones that really adhered to those specific subgenres. Now, I think this is, time has sort of backed off from this a little bit, where I think that, like I say, I think the bottom for a lack of tolerance of musical diversity really occurs in the 90s. And since then, it's probably people have become a little more tolerant of a little more diversity with some bands. And I've noticed that within the subgenres in particular. I mean, you look at black metal, for instance. I mean, there's lots of black metal bands that have just kept doing the same thing basically over and over, right? The creepy atmosphere, the super fast guitars, the garly vocals, the blast beats on the drums. But others have progressed quite a bit. Like check out an Enslaved album or Satyricon or anything that Sean has been doing. I mean, they're incorporating, these black metal bands are incorporating all kinds of different styles, like very moody, almost Pink Floydy at times, incorporating some folk, some jazz even, like they're all over the map, some of them, right? But they're only getting so popular. Like Enslaved is never going to become a mainstream band. They're still way too weird and too diverse. But I think there's a little more tolerance for diversity than maybe there was a few decades ago, but nothing close to what happened in the 70s, right? And let's look at that real quick. So this is not a complete list, but I think I've probably captured most of the successful heavy bands, if you want to group them as heavy, in the 1970s, right? And I guess I've got 17 or 18 here. And what I've done is I've come up with this little index, right? Where it goes from, say, 0 to 10. And if you're classified, say, 0 to 3, you have limited diversity. In other words, a band like that is kind of putting out the same music over and over again, or the same style within an album, that sort of thing. If you rank, say, 4 to 6, you have reasonable diversity, right? That you're doing more than just one thing all the time, whether that be within an album or, say, from album to album. And then, but by the time you get to, say, 7 and 8, you're very diverse, or you're extremely diverse if you're 9 and 10, right? So if you kind of see, and again, I think I'm sure I've missed a couple, but these would be probably the most successful, most popular heavy bands of the 1970s, okay? And I think Led Zeppelin is probably the epitome of an extremely diverse heavy band. I mean, Zeppelin did all kinds of things. Yes, if you want to pigeonhole Led Zeppelin, they were a hard rock band, but they did way more than that. Any Zeppelin fan will know that. I mean, again, they did bluesy stuff, folky stuff. They were kind of proggy at times. They had dabbled even in country and Western once in a while. They did music that wasn't even really classifiable at times. Queen too. I mean, people who only know Queen for the hits would probably really be surprised if they listened to the entirety of, say, Queen 2 or Queen 1 or Sheer Heart Attack. Like those early albums, at times, Queen was really heavy. But they were poppy, they were whimsical, they were kind of proggy at times, you know. They did all kinds of things, right? So did Blue Oyster Cult. Blue Oyster Cult was never as popular as Zeppelin or Queen, but they were reasonably popular. They were really quite successful band in the 70s, especially. And they were incredibly diverse, right? Like most people will pigeonhole, well, yeah, that's that heavy metal band or that hard rock band. Yeah, they were, I guess, but they did so many things. Like, and really all their albums, but some of their most popular albums, like things like Agents of Fortune or Spectres or Mirrors, if you listen to those albums in their entirety, right, there's maybe only 1 or 2 songs on those albums that are truly even hard rock, let alone metal, right? Like they really did all kinds of stuff. And I would argue all these other bands, like the original Alice Cooper band was doing all kinds of stuff. Uriah Heep, a band that was known as the Beach Boys of heavy metal. Well, that name alone should tell you that they were doing all kinds of stuff, right? Nazareth too was doing all kinds of different things other than just hard rock. Thin Lizzy, a really interesting band that incorporated, along with hard rock, and harmony guitars and all kinds of stuff like that, but sort of Irish folk in their music. At times they were kind of bluesy. They were certainly folky at times. So they were doing all kinds of different things. UFO, again, masters of light and shade, not unlike what Zeppelin did. The Scorpions, especially early Scorpions with Uli Roth, were doing all kinds of stuff under the umbrella of hard rock, right? Rush was always diverse and still is, but especially the 70s Rush. I mean, again, I'm thinking like a lot of their concept stuff, like things like Caress of Steel, 2112, A Farewell to Kings. I mean, all kinds of different moods going on there, right? Rush wasn't just proto heavy metal. They did all kinds of stuff. So did Aerosmith, so did Triumph, and on it goes, right? Even Nugent, Ted, he did more than just gonzo rock all the time, and on it goes, right? I mean, I'll mention quickly too, because a lot of people will point to, say, Judas Priest and Black Sabbath. Well, they just do heavy metal. They're just these heavy bands. Yeah, they were heavy most of the time. I agree with that. But I'm talking 70s Priest and 70s Sabbath. I mean, if you really think all Black Sabbath did was just bludgeoning riffs like Iron Man, and, I mean, they were great at that, of course. Listen to Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath in its entirety, or Never Say Die, or Technical Ecstasy, or even Sabotage. Sabbath was always heavy, but different moods of heavy, right? And people didn't always get that. And even Kiss and AC/DC, I would argue they were reasonably diverse if you look at their 70s stuff. And like I say, with AC/DC, the Bon Scott era, okay, they weren't super diverse, but they didn't release the same album time after time in the 70s. They kind of did that, like I say, sort of after Back in Black, right? So anyway, my point is, in the 70s, you could become really successful if you're a heavy band, or most bands, if you did all kinds of different stuff. The public rewarded you for that, right? That didn't happen in other eras. Okay, so that's important to keep in mind when we try to understand, well, what's up with King's X, Because King's X, as we're going to see, would have fit in beautifully in the 70s, right? All right, so a little more on King's X and how people like to classify them and all that stuff, because they're almost impossible to classify, which in the 70s would have been fine, but when they were happening was actually working against them. So some have coined King's X as progressive metal. I don't know if I buy that, but I understand why people might say that. And essential forerunners to the subgenre of prog metal. So put King's X in, say, with Dream Theater and Fate's Warning, Spock's Beard, Queen's Reich, Arena, Symphony X. I don't think they're a great fit there, but I get, as I say, I get why people would say that. Others assert that King's X had a hand in influencing the Seattle grunge movement that crested in the 90s, another sort of scene, I guess you could say, of heavy music that I didn't mention, but I certainly could have before. So grunge crested in the 1990s, and certainly many titans of that scene, such as Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, have declared their admiration for King's X, right? Some will go so far as to say King's X kind of was grunge. Again, I'm not sure I buy that, but I get why they'd say that, because so many grunge stars thought King's X was amazing. They were right. But okay, indeed, respect from their peers, i.e. King's X's peers, and their core fan base has never been in short supply. If you like King's X, you tend to really, really like them. It's mainstream acceptance that has been fleeting for the band. Why? Okay, primarily, I believe it has to do with timing and an inability to be pigeonholed. You can't pigeonhole King's X as much as you want to try. King's X's mastering of several styles would have fit seamlessly in the 1970s. King's X would have been stars in the 70s. I'm convinced of that, right? Because as we were talking about, in the 70s, when all hard rock bands did more than just be heavy, right? And indeed, even the monster of them all, Black Sabbath, as I was arguing, was far more diverse than they often were given credit for. But by the time of the late 1980s, right, heavy music was fragmenting into subgenres, and King's X didn't have a home. They never really fit into anything. Okay, you want to call them prog metal, sort of, kind of, but I don't buy that, and I'll kind of get into that in a second too, right? But really, King's X had no home, right? They'd have been fine in the 70s, but because remember, their career starts in the late 80s and early 90s, really, and that's when everything's fragmented into these subgenres. But they didn't fit in any of them, right? They were too heavy for the pop fan. They were too complicated for hair metal and simple hard rock. They weren't zany enough, say, for alternative metal scene. I mean, again, King's X is kind of zany, but they weren't to the level of, say, Faith No More or Primus, right? They weren't consistently heavy enough for power metal or thrash metal. And let's face it, they're miles away from, say, death metal or black metal, right? So King's X was in the proverbial no man's land. They didn't really fit anywhere. And it should also be mentioned, another quick thing I'll mention about King's X, that the band's muddled marketing approach, which at times emphasized their Christian roots, only to be contradicted by the band members themselves, did not ingratiate them to the metal audience, right? It's not so much that they, personally, I have no problem with a Christian metal band, whatever, that's great, right? I mean, maybe some metal fans do, I certainly don't. I think the fact, though, that it was so confusing with King's X, I think that hurt them, right? Much in the same way, the heavy community was confused by doom metalers' Trouble and their alleged white metal stance around the same time, right? What happened here, and I think this hurt King's X, ultimately conflicting messages and misconceptions emanating from the artists, their management, or the press are anathema to effective promotion and marketing, right? The fact that nobody really knew, right? They're marketed in some circles as a Christian metal band or Christian band, and then the band members are saying to themselves, well, we're not Christians, or we're not anymore. So this just confused things. So unless you're attempting to cultivate a mysterious or ambiguous evil vibe, actually that worked for Boyce or Cult in a way, or Danzig or others, right? Being having mixed messages and being hard to understand won't work for you. I mean, if you're trying to be mysteriously evil, it might, but King's X was obviously not trying to do that, right? So all this confusion around the band also hurt them, I think, right? All right, at any rate, if it is true that King's X is most logically classified within the progressive metal camp, then it's clear why wider acceptance is elusive. So if you want to accept that, I still think, though, there's a good reason why King's X is not real popular. The commercial and creative crest of prog rock, which was the forerunner of prog metal, was also in the 70s. Okay, so again, timing's working against them yet again. Prog linchpins such as Yes, Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, King Crimson, Gentle Giant, Kansas, and others, these prog bands, right, reached their starry heights based on material released in that decade. If any of these bands would have started in the late 1980s, right, or beyond, I'm convinced that commercial achievement would have been pretty much what King's X is at, right? Or at best, reaching the slightly more successful statures of, say, Queensryche, or more recently, Opeth or Porcupine Tree. So Queensryche, Opeth, and Porcupine Tree are probably examples of prog metal. And these bands are reasonably successful, right? They're more popular than King's X, but they're certainly not at the level of, say, Pink Floyd or Led Zeppelin or something, like nothing close, right? So I'm convinced even Jethro Tull or Pink Floyd, if those bands would have started in the 90s, I am convinced there's no way they'd be as popular as they are today. It's because they started in the 70s when this was all permissible, right? Okay, but on the other hand, if one does not hear King's X as a prog metal band, I kind of don't, to be honest with you, and I would say their perchant for populating most of their albums with shorter songs would undoubtedly cause some serious debate. It really wouldn't matter because their stylistic diversity would still constitute a significant barrier. So whether you want to call King's X prog metal or not doesn't really matter, right? The fact that King's X is so diverse, that's their big barrier today, right? Or has been for the last few decades. The most successful artists today appear to be those that are easily categorized, right? Again, it's really about timing. Would Led Zeppelin, arguably the best example of a truly diverse heavy band, would they have been a big seller if their temporal domain began in the 1980s, late 1980s or beyond? I'm convinced no, Zeppelin would not be the popular monster they are today if they had started, say, in 1988 when King's X did. I'm convinced they wouldn't have. Zeppelin's mixture of accessible hits, driving hard rock, progressive tendencies, blues-influenced jams, folky ballads, and etc., were allowed to thrive in the 70s, a time when bands didn't have to do one thing or one thing most of the time to comfortably exist in the subgenres, right? But the massive audience that Zeppelin formed in the 70s spilled over into the 1980s and beyond, which provided the foundation for their best known songs to become evergreen favorites on classic rock radio. That's the key. If you make it to classic rock radio, you're on a media source that essentially makes you immortal, right? King's X never made it and they never will. But let's just say, world of make-believe, if King's X would have been around to release, say, Goldilocks or Black Flag in 1974, maybe these hooky tunes would have morphed into something much bigger and ultimately gained traction with classic rock radio programmers, and the massive pool of Class 2 music fans would have really resonated, right? Remember, you can see in part 2 of this series, and I talk about it in part 3 as well, I classified all music fans based on their inclination to value heavy music. The Class 2 fan is somebody who likes some heavy music, and there's a whole lot of these folks, but they really just like the hits and the classics, right? And I'm saying if King's X would have actually started in the 70s, maybe some of their most accessible hits would have become big songs, right? And it now would be played on classic rock radio that Class 2 fan would be eating up, right? But it never happened because that's not when King's X started their career, right? So yet once the heavy music scene started morphing into a myriad of subgenres in the 1980s, as I was saying, and then continued to splinter ever since, most groups had to either conform to a style and be satisfied with, at best, a ceiling of reasonable acclaim within that category, such as, Slayer being popular as pretty much just a thrash metal band, or Cannibal Corpse being popular as just a death metal band, or Immortal in black metal, or Dream Theater in prog, right? You'll never get as big as Zeppelin in any of these subgenres or any of those 70s bands, arguably, right? But you can get reasonably popular if you just stay in your lane, sort of say, in these niches, right? So you either accept that you're going to get only so popular, but you can get reasonably popular if you stay in the subgenre, or accept the fact that if you are musically diverse and you don't fit in with any subgenre, you're going to just have to have small audiences. You can't have it both ways. Either you're going to fit in a subgenre and reach maybe modest levels of acclaim, or you're not going to fit in a subgenre and you're always going to have a really small audience. Like, that's how it is now. In the 70s, no, but now that's how it is, right? King's X seems to understand this, right? In spite of their uncanny ability to write memorable tunes, they have never wavered in their desire to experiment with different moods and styles. That's always what they've done. It's illogical to expect widespread stardom under these circumstances. Persistent cries of injustice from portions of their fan base won't change this, okay? King's X is about where it should be. Rated highly by their hardcore audience, which is both artists and non-artists, actually, and invisible to pretty much everyone else. So King's X is not underrated, okay? Because of when they happened, and because they couldn't be pigeonholed in the 1980s and 1990s, they basically were going to be stuck with just a small audience forever, right? If they would have happened in the 70s, different story. I guess that's what happens when a truly great band exists out of its time. And I think that's why King's X has never reached the popularity that some of their fans think they should have, but really, I think their position is actually completely justifiable. That's it. Hopefully you'll check out part 5, where I'm actually a little bit of a detour again, but I think it's really related. I'm going to talk about this uneasy relationship that catchiness and melody has always had with a lot of heavy rock fans, Okay, so this is really related to some of the stuff I'm talking about with King's X, but I'm going to elaborate on that theme a little more because I think there's an interesting some interesting issues to explore here. And yes, I am going to talk about the perils of hair metal. Horrors, horrors, horrors. So I hope you'll join me for that. Thank you for listening to this episode, and I'll catch you next time. Take care.